The high-pitched keening sliced through the recycled air of the cabin like a thin wire, a sound that climbed into throats and refused to let go. It smelled faintly of formula and worn plastic, and the overhead lights seemed suddenly too bright. Heads turned in synchronized little movements, as if an invisible conductor had tapped the roof. Some faces tightened with irritation, some softened with pity, and others pretended not to hear while their eyes betrayed curiosity. In the aisle by the window, a man in a tailored suit rocked a wriggling infant against his chest, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, jaw clenched, fingers searching for a calm he could not buy. He was Daniel Brooks, a man used to deals that closed and rooms that bent to his schedule, but his hands shook the way hands do when loss has hollowed out the map of a life. The baby pushed out another desperate wail, little fists like punctuation marks against the linen, and the tiny heartbeat against his breast felt like a question he could not answer. Around him, the flight attendant Maya adjusted a tray with a practiced smile. Jorge, the retired teacher, craned his neck. Priya, the student, tucked an earbud half in, as if to muffle but not to escape. Marcus, the businessman, tapped his watch, and Linda, the nurse, shifted forward with a look that mixed sympathy and readiness to help. The air was charged with judgment and compassion in equal measure, the kind of tension that makes even the click of a seatbelt sound loaded. What would happen in the next minutes would reshape more than a seat assignment. Daniel remembered the night the world had narrowed to one empty bedroom. He remembered the hollow sound of a house after someone who sang in the kitchen was no longer there, the way a toothbrush left its own memory in the cup. He had learned to negotiate grief like contracts, to place motions of care on a spreadsheet of obligations. Yet being alone with a newborn on a plane exposed the rawness of his inexperience. The seat by the window had been his idea, a place to build a small fortress of control in the middle of turbulence. He had layers of grief stacked beneath his suit, an ache he had not fully named. And the crying threaded through that ache, knitting it into a wider loneliness. At home he had a nanny schedule, he had cooks and a calendar of playdates, but tenderness was not something his credit cards could deliver when the night narrowed into a howl. Each sob was a reminder of promises unmet, each failed attempt to soothe a measure of his fear. He cradled the infant and whispered instructions he had read online, his voice thin with the strain of a man who had been taught competence but not consolation. The scent of his cologne could not cover the hospital smell in his memory, and the baby kept reaching for the shape of a hand that was not there. The cabin murmurs swelled into commentary, voices threaded through the rows. "He should have asked for help," said a man near the galley, his name announced later as Omar, a teenager with earbuds dangling, but his words were softer than the thought. "Poor guy," whispered Claire, a tourist with a map rolled under her arm, while someone else, Rachel, said quietly, "Maybe the mother is not around." A woman in a green coat, the name tag said Linda, offered a tissue and a look that said it was okay to be vulnerable. Marcus the businessman folded his arms and sighed, and Priya adjusted her backpack as if repositioning herself from a story to a spectator. Each reaction was a small mirror reflecting the many ways a community fills silence with meaning. The tension thickened when a nearby passenger banged the armrest and muttered impatience, and the collective gaze crescendoed into a chorus of opinions, advice, and thin pity. The plane felt smaller, and social air pressure seemed to push Daniel into a corner where every other human was both jury and audience. He tried to soothe the baby with a low humming he barely trusted, but the sound was swallowed in the metal throat of the aircraft. Then Sarah Kim moved down the aisle like someone steadying herself before stepping into cold water. She was a single mom, a hair tie on her wrist, a denim jacket scuffed at the elbows, and the kind of quiet that belongs to people who make room for others without announcing it. She carried a canvas tote with a juice box and a small blanket smelling faintly of lavender and day-old cereal. 4 passengers glanced as she stood. Maya, the flight attendant, leaned forward. Jorge, the retired teacher, smiled a cautious encouragement. Priya watched with wide, compassionate eyes, and Marcus the businessman raised an eyebrow that softened when she reached Daniel. The soles of her shoes scuffed like soft percussion on the aisle carpet, and the air shifted to the sound of steps. She did not flinch at the crying. She looked at the baby as if she recognized a particular sadness. Up close, the infant smelled of milk and salt, the cheeks slightly damp, and the tiny fists curled as if each finger held a small insistence. Sarah extended a hand, a simple motion that broke something heavier than the noise. "May I?" she asked, voice low, offering her blanket like an invitation. "I have a little experience with fussy flights," she added with a small laugh that was mostly apology. Daniel blinked, startled, defensive instinct rising. I am trying everything," he said, words tumbling. "I know," she replied quickly, calm like a practiced rhythm. "Can I hold him for a minute? My son used to fly with me all the time, and a different seat can do miracles." The exchange that followed spooled into a conversation. That felt like careful choreography. Daniel hesitated, thumb worrying the fabric of his cuff. "I do not want anything wrong," he said. "I just do not know what to do when he cries like this." Sarah smiled with a tired courage. "Just breathe with me," she said. "Can you hand him to me slowly while I hum? It helps him find a heartbeat." There was a pause weighted with trust. "Okay," Daniel answered, voice small. "Okay, please." "I will be gentle," Sarah promised. "It will be all right. I have a blanket." "Do you need anything else?" Daniel asked, the businessman in his voice melting into a father. "No, just your hand on his back if you can," she asked. "We will do it together." This back and forth expanded into 7 small exchanges, each one a tactile stitch sewing strangers into a temporary family. Around them, Maya moved quietly, offering a warm bottle and a quiet nod. Jorge hummed an old lullaby under his breath as if to add to the chorus. Priya watched with her hand over her heart. And Marcus, who had earlier scowled, now sat straighter, listening. If this moment touched you, take a breath and stay with the feeling for a second. If this touched you, what did you feel in that instant where strangers became helpers? Share with us what gesture moved you most. You can begin your comment with "when," so others can jump into your story easily. Tell us about the most unexpected kindness you ever saw in a public place. Did someone offer a seat, a shoulder, a coffee, or an umbrella at the exact wrong moment made right? Your stories matter, and when you write them here, you remind others that empathy is contagious. Your words can become invitations for readers who might be scared to try a small brave thing. If you prefer, describe the moment in 1 sentence, beginning with "when," and we will read as many as we can. Your comment helps build a community that sees and responds, and it helps people who read this later find the courage to act. Now, let us return to find out what happened after that gentle exchange and how one short act changed more than one flight. When Sarah lifted the baby, the cabin seemed to inhale. The crying folded into a hiccup, then into soft breaths that matched the cadence of the little song she hummed. The baby clung to her like a small animal seeking shelter, fingers curling into the hem of her shirt, cheek damp but calming. The smell of lavender from the blanket mingled with the metallic warmth of the cabin, and for a few measured seconds there was a silence that felt like a reward. Tears appeared at the corners of Daniel's eyes before he knew what they were, and he watched the way Sarah rocked, the subtle set of her shoulders that balanced patience and practiced calm. Maya fetched a cup of water. For Daniel, Marcus slid his briefcase away to make space, as if he had learned closeness faster than expected, and Jorge softly recited a line from a children's book, his voice creaking like an old porch swing. The hush was not total. There were still rustles of paper and the murmur of the engine, but the heaviness had lifted enough to let something fragile take shape. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice raw. "I do not know how to repay you." Sarah gave a small smile that was both shy and proud. "No need to repay," she said. "A promise will do. When you can, help someone else." The words landed like a promise and sat quietly between them. The baby drifted toward sleep in her arms, as if absconding from the noise that had earlier been so insistent. Around them, other passengers wiped an eye, rearranged a shoulder, or simply sat with changed faces. Empathy, once seen, had become permissible. The plane touched down with the soft staccato of tires on wet runway, the city lights blurring into a watercolor outside the oval windows. As passengers gathered their things, Daniel stayed a beat longer, cradling a sleeping infant and feeling how small weight could recalibrate a heart. He found Sarah at the gate, collecting her things with the steady motion of someone who has learned to parent through improvisation and courage. He asked for her number, then caught himself and fumbled for words that matched the gratitude in his chest. "I want to help you with groceries sometime," he said finally. "I want to make sure you and your son have what you need." Sarah looked surprised, then contemplative, then she nodded. "1 month from now, there is a food bank on Elm where you can volunteer," she said. "Come and bring a friend. Even a single hour helps." They exchanged contacts, but it was more than a pragmatic trade. It was the seed of a small community tie. Maya, the flight attendant, waved them off. Priya offered to babysit playdates in theory. Marcus promised to donate to the neighborhood pantry. Omar found himself mentioning a local shelter to a coworker, and Linda left a card with the number of a local community group. Names and faces that had been strangers now felt like parts of a network knitting together by small gestures. The immediate consequence was concrete and quiet. 1 month later, a volunteer sign-up sheet listed Daniel's name under the midday shift. He arrived with a dozen canned goods and a nervous humility that made the volunteers smile. He worked alongside Sarah for several hours, ears filling with chatter, hands packing boxes, the smell of coffee and bread rising in the warehouse. There was awkward laughter, clumsy competence, and a tangible sense of repair as donations stacked into something useful. 6 months later, the community had a modest fund to support single parents on night shifts, seeded by anonymous donations and a small group of regular volunteers who had met on a plane. Daniel had learned to sit with silence and let compassion instruct his schedule. Sora was invited to speak at a local event about small acts and big effects. The baby had grown into a toddler who smiled wide enough to soften anyone's day. The outcome was more than a feeling. It was a promise kept in actions, a donation that bought diapers and time, a community that rearranged priorities to include care for those who were vulnerable. The scene that began with noise closed with a kind of quiet healing, an outline of courage drawn in ordinary ink. A gesture had settled like sediment in the river of their lives, simple, durable, and suddenly visible. One person's willingness to step into a small risk had calmed a child, restored a father, and anchored a single mom in a network of support. The cabin had taught them all how to respond with presence rather than with opinion. If stories like this matter to you, join us and subscribe to hear more true accounts of compassion that change small corners of the world. Sometimes a single hand reaches across an aisle and changes the direction of many lives. The kindness of strangers can turn loneliness into promise.